Let me start with a mistake I think almost everyone is making. They look at the lower number of Iranian missile launches and assume that tells the story. They hear officials say 70%, 80%, maybe more of the launchers have been destroyed, and they assume the trajectory is obvious. Iran is losing capacity. Iran is running out of options. Iran is firing less because Iran can no longer do what it did at the beginning. And then another heavy precision strike lands and tears apart whatever it touches. That contradiction is where the real story begins. The most dangerous reading of this war is not that Iran is breaking. It is that Iran has shifted from expenditure to preservation. The real story is not launch count. It is reserve logic at the beginning of a war. Volume can be useful. You fire more because you want to flood defenses, study reactions, exhaust interceptors, and stretch the enemy across multiple axes at once. But if that first phase succeeds, even partially, if the defender has already burned through large amounts of anti-missile inventory, if radar and air defense networks are strained, if battle damage assessment starts improving, then the logic changes. You no longer need to prove you can shoot a lot. You need to prove that whatever you still choose to fire can still break something that matters. That is where I think Iran is. Now, I am not arguing Iran is undamaged. That would be absurd. The country has been pounded. Civilian infrastructure has been wrecked. Tehran has taken terrible punishment. Launchers have certainly been lost. Facilities have certainly been lost. The visible pain is real, but pain is not the same thing as strategic defeat. And Washington keeps talking as though visible pain automatically equals approaching collapse. That assumption has trapped great powers before, and it traps them again because they start believing they are watching the end of the story when in fact they are only watching the end of the first phase. What if the decline in launch numbers does not primarily mean depletion? What if it means Iran now believes it has done enough early burning of interceptors and enough early signaling of range and reach, and is now moving into a more deliberate phase where every strike is selected for maximum strategic consequence? That would fit the evidence much better than the official triumphalism. The weapons that still get through are not wild shots. They are not symbolic fireworks. They are precise and they do serious damage that matters, because precision changes the economics of war. A side that can place a smaller number of high consequence strikes no longer needs to match the old tempo. It only needs to keep enough capacity in reserve to threaten the next ladder up. And that next ladder is what should worry everyone in the Gulf, because the real fear is not what Iran has already chosen to do. It is what Iran has not yet done, because it may be waiting to see whether the United States and Israel go one step further. This is why every discussion of Karg Island, every threat against core oil infrastructure, every strike on economically essential nodes matters so much. There's a threshold beyond which Tehran will no longer read the war as coercive pressure and start reading it as an attempt to leave Iran permanently crippled. If that threshold is crossed, the war changes category. Then you stop talking about controlled exchange and start talking about systemic retaliation. Oil terminals become target sets. Port facilities become target sets. Desalination plants become target sets. Shipping becomes targetable by design, not by accident. The Gulf ceases to be a tense waterway and becomes a corridor of permanent risk. Insurance spikes are no longer temporary. Commercial planning no longer assumes near-term normalization. Allies begin asking not how to help, but how to survive. That is the part of the picture official briefings never really want to dwell on, because it forces the most uncomfortable question of all. What exactly is the United States trying to achieve from here that is still achievable? The public conversation keeps pretending there are several serious choices still on the table. Send more force, intensify pressure, create a new show of strength, maybe even talk about a ground option, as though that phrase itself were not insane in this geography. But when I look at the map and when I look at modern warfare, I do not see a menu. I see a trap dressed up as choice. Take a ground invasion first. It does not make sense militarily, politically, or structurally. Iran is enormous. The terrain is awful. Distances are punishing. And the old method of slow giant buildup is no longer safe in the age of persistent surveillance. The moment you begin concentrating men, armor, shipping, fuel, ammunition, bridging equipment, air defense, and logistics close enough to prepare for an invasion, you begin advertising targets. Everything is visible now, or visible enough. Ports receiving equipment are watched. Roads filling with military traffic are watched. Aircraft cycles are watched. Staging grounds are watched. And once they are watched, they can be hit drones, missiles, and precision strike systems. Mean you may start taking serious losses before your grand offensive even properly begins. People still talk about modern war as though it were 1991, when a massive force could gather over time, establish a huge rear area, and trust that momentum would carry the operation once it began. That world is vanishing against an opponent with missiles, drones, and persistent observation. your buildup itself becomes a vulnerable phase of combat. And even if the United States wanted to try something so reckless, the force structure is not what it once was. The army is smaller, the Marines are lighter, the political appetite is much weaker, the public case is much weaker. The strategic purpose is much weaker. It is fantasy sold as toughness. So if boots on the ground are not serious, what remains? Endless punishment from the air and sea. That is the option people retreat to when all the other ones fail, and it is where strategy often dies. Air and naval power can destroy a great deal. They can kill commanders, crater runways, collapse buildings, burn depots, and devastate infrastructure. But none of that guarantees an enduring political result, especially when the opponent still retains hidden inventory, precision, strike capability, and enough state cohesion to keep choosing rather than surrendering. This is why I keep coming back to reserve logic. A country that is firing less but preserving enough capability to threaten the real economic and military nerves of the region is not yet a country at the end of its war. It is a country shaping the bargaining range of its war's conclusion, and that makes the entire American position far more fragile than official rhetoric suggests. Because what if the real problem here is not simply battlefield friction? What if it is the absence of strategy itself? If your objective was regime change through decapitation, that is not a strategy. It is an impulse leadership. Assassinations do not automatically generate favorable politics. Sometimes they do the opposite. They delay internal evolution, nationalize anger, and convince even future post-war elites that accommodation with you would look like weakness or treason. If your objective was permanent security for Israel through the reduction of Iran into a broken, submissive state, that also looks much harder now than it did in the fantasy slides. Iran has not submitted. The regional backlash is not moving in that direction. And the more this war spreads costs across the Gulf and across global markets, the more every state starts asking a simple question. Why are we paying for an end state we did not choose and may not benefit from? That is when the conflict becomes bigger than the battlefield, because from Tehran's point of view, the war is no longer about absorbing punishment and waiting for mercy. It is about ending the old order under which hostile military power sits across the Gulf. Israeli escalation remains structurally available, and regional governments can quietly enable attacks while hoping Iran will absorb the consequences silently. Iranian voices are increasingly explicit. They're saying the old status quo is over. They will not live permanently with an architecture that leaves them exposed to repeated existential threat. That means the actual end state they want is not modest. It is structural. They want an environment in which the United States can no longer operate around Iran in the same way, from the same positions, with the same assumptions. And now Washington confronts the reality it never wanted to admit. Keep climbing the escalation ladder may trigger exactly the regional damage it most fears. To stop climbing may require accepting a settlement that looks, in practical terms, like Iran withstanding the full application of American power and forcing a new conversation about the future military order of the Gulf. Neither of those outcomes resembles the victory language people were promised. This is where the fork actually is. Path 1, escalation without solution. More strikes, more symbolic toughness, more devastation, more pressure on the remaining Iranian economic spine, more chances for Tehran to unleash the next layer of retaliation, more damage to energy, water, shipping, and regional infrastructure, and still no durable political answer. Path 2, an off-ramp disguised as success. Publicly, Washington would say it set back nuclear capabilities, degraded military assets, and restored deterrence. Privately, the war would end in an arrangement that acknowledges limits on what bombing can force, limits on what basing networks can guarantee, limits on what the old Gulf order can now sustain. It would probably require a broader treaty logic around the waterway and regional security, something not owned by one side alone, but guaranteed by multiple powers with direct energy interests. That kind of ending would feel unsatisfying to the people who wanted total submission, which is precisely why it is the more plausible ending. And hanging over all of this is the darkest strategic lesson of the war. Every country watching learns the same thing. If you do not have a nuclear deterrent, and if the United States decides your government is unacceptable, then you remain vulnerable to devastating conventional punishment. That is a horrific lesson for the world, but it is the lesson wars like this teach with brutal clarity. Maybe Iran was already debating that conclusion internally after this war. Far more states will. That is why this conflict may end up making the world more dangerous, even if it eventually stops. The side claiming to prevent catastrophe may be manufacturing the incentives for the next catastrophe. So let me come back to the opening contradiction. They say Iran is degraded. They say Iran is firing less. They say the trend line is favorable. Then another precise heavy strike lands and reminds everyone that hidden reserve is more important than public narrative. That is the terrifying part. Not that Iran still has the ability to hurt people. We already knew that. The terrifying part is that Iran may still believe it has enough in reserve to choose when the war climbs again, and enough political will to endure until Washington has to pick between a larger disaster and an ending it never wanted. A war without strategy does not end because one side gets tired of the briefing language. It ends when reality cuts away every false option. And I think that is what is happening. Now, the war is slowly forcing Washington toward the answer it most dislikes, that a patient enemy with preserved capacity can be far more dangerous than an enemy that empties everything in a burst of rage. The frightening thing is not that Iran has suffered and still kept fighting. The frightening thing is that Iran may have suffered, learned, measured, and saved the most dangerous part of its response for later.